slide. There is a smartphone app that's called Moment, and this app sort of caters to people that struggle with managing how much time they spend on their smartphone. And what it is just an app for monitoring how much time you spend on each of your apps, and then visualizing that to you, so you can use that information to sort of regulate your behavior in the way that you want. Now, recently, Moment conducted a survey with around 20,000 of the users, where they asked them to indicate for each of the sort of the pieces of functionality they use on their device, whether they were happy or unhappy with the time they had spent using that app. And this is the finding. So up here you sort of got all of the different sort of apps and functionalities. There's a lot of the usual suspects here: Netflix, YouTube, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Perhaps not surprisingly, many of the companies that are sort of scoring the highest here on average time, it's also companies that are actively trying to get their users to spend as much time as possible on their devices. And of course, all of the sort of unhappy smileys here represent the average number of minutes per day that people that said they were unhappy with their usage used, and all of the happy faces represent the amount of time that people who were happy with the usage said that they spent. And the interesting thing is this, of course. If any of you guys are classical economists or believe in a rational model of human behavior, then this makes zero sense whatsoever. Because if you use an app more, I mean, it should be almost by definition be because you value more highly spend using that app. But of course, that's not actually how humans work in practice. So the interesting thing is, what the hell is going on here? I'm doing a PhD in computer science at Oxford, but I'm actually a cognitive psychologist by training. And my PhD research focuses on self-regulation and self-control and attention in relation to how people use smartphones and laptops. And basically, my PhD is about what good design looks like for devices that make it as easy as possible for people to use them in the way that they wanted to use them. And that's and can we maybe close the windows or something? And that's an interesting topic because even if people get super much value out of their devices, it's also the case that sort of most people say that they struggle with self-control in relation to how they use their smartphones and their laptops, whether that's distracted driving or kind of not being able to not check your phone when you're in social situations, or failing to go to bed because you have to check whether Trump triggered a nuclear war since last time you went to BBC News, and so on and so forth. When we think about what's going on here, especially in the context of this sort of hackathon, then we can think about this in relation to almost as two separate challenges, as it were. And one is that when you think about the nature of smartphones, for example, then these are universal computing devices that can implement a virtual infinity of functionality. And a lot of the functionality that we've ended up implementing on them is functionality that people are innately wired to care about, what's the latest gossip from your friends or the latest news and so on. And at the same time, you carry these devices with you anywhere you go, and that's historically this is a completely new situation for human behavioral control, because the actions that we have available to us used to be very limited by the physical context we were in. So it shouldn't surprise us, perhaps, that having constant access to everything, no matter what time it is and no matter where you are, might not be sort of the easiest scenario for humans to adjust their behavior, especially because we are not machines. We have all of these weird biases, right? So, I mean, one blog post expressed it as, "I can't handle infinity in my pocket." So there is a sort of an interesting challenge here around how do we get the best of both worlds? How do we have permanent access to all of these different tasks without it just meaning that we are permanently distracted? There's a really interesting design challenge, which sort of limits we need in order to sort of regulate our behavior efficiently. But then the other side of the coin, of course, is what people often refer to as the attention economy, and that is that a lot of the people that build the functionality on these devices have a vested interest in trying to build them, their apps, in a way that make you use them as much as possible and as frequently as possible, because then they can serve you the largest number of ads and harvest the largest number of data, and that's what maximizes their advertising revenue. How many of you have heard the term attention economy before? Almost all of you. Excellent. Normally when we talk about the attention economy, people often start by referring to this essay by Herbert Simon from 1971, where he said that when you have a wealth of information, it implies a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. He said this in relation to how we should design information systems, because sometimes people that built systems, computer systems in the 70s, had this inclination towards presenting lots of information to people, because then they were informed and so on. And Herbert Simon said, oh no, actually, when we've got loads and loads of information, it's more important to filter that information efficiently so that people are just presented with what's relevant for them to make a good decision. That is of course still true, and it's a big sort of task on the web where you have this infinity of information to be able to filter efficiently. But it's also a little bit more sort of tricky when you think about the mixed incentives on the web, because the business model that ended up winning on the web is a business model where everything is free-ish, which means that people, instead of paying with money, they pay with their attention and with their data. And that means that, well, one thing it means is that what funds Google's multi-billion-dollar business is that at the end of the day, all of the information that they gather is something they gather in order to serve you ads most efficiently. They have the most lucrative advertising markets on the entire planet, because they can serve you very, very, very targeted ads at the time when you're searching for something on Google, and because they know everything there is to know about you. Facebook's model is the same. So one of the sort of unintended side consequences of this everything is free business model is that we get this sort of Orwellian surveillance capitalism where there's this market for personal data. And the other side of it is also that some of the information that's out there is information that are almost like Trojan horses that are sort of deliberately manufactured to have a form so that it sort of penetrates, consumes your attention. So you get to click because that makes money in itself. And I saw that a couple of the projects up on our sort of low-tech dashboard over here were fake news projects. So one sort of direct negative consequence of the attention economy is that there's a market for anything that makes people click, no matter whether it's true or not. Some people might say, "Oh, what's new here? Who cares?" Because we've had this sort of thing going. This has been going on for a while in the tabloid press, and like fake news is nothing new. But the new thing is that is probably the scalability of it. That it becomes more and more difficult for people to tell the. Well, I mean, you have this sort of clickbait race to the button, because because no one wants to pay for anything online. So also the sort of established news organizations also get this sort of temptation to become clickbaitified, because if everything is just served on your Facebook newsfeed, then no one can really tell the difference anyway, and then everyone needs to write it in a way that makes people click in the first place, and so on. So many of these sort of fake news stories have become very, very far-reaching. You've probably all seen like that BuzzFeed news article about how the top fake news sort of outperformed real news. Probably as you'd expect, because it's easier for me to come up with something really, really exciting if I don't even have to be constrained by reality, right? Okay, so anyway, so this just means that When we think about this space, there's actually sort of two separate grand challenges that is interesting in this sort of hackathon context. And the first one is, what design features do always connected devices need in order to not be always distracting? And then sort of if we have a good solution to that, then I mean the separate question is, how can the attention economy be disrupted? Because it could be that we have a good answer to how to design these devices, but if we can't get companies to design them that way in the first place, then it probably doesn't really matter. So there's two interesting things here to think about. I thought it might be useful for me to just mention a couple of things that is currently going on in relation to these two things that some of you might be interested in thinking about. So when you just look at the first one, there is this sort of interesting meta market on app stores for what you could call anti-distraction tools, and that's apps and browser extensions that are meant to like save you from your other apps on your devices in various ways. So it's like tools that people use to help change the interfaces of the devices in ways that they feel make it easier for them to exert effective self-control. So by and large, these tools are tools that people use to remove distractions from the devices or block their own internet access and so on. It's tools that people use to track themselves and then just get user stats over like the Moment app I mentioned in the beginning. Or it's tools that people use more hilariously perhaps to reward or punish themselves for the way in which they use their devices. And there's like hundreds and hundreds of these. So there's already this sort of interesting experimentation going on about what the useful interfaces of the future could look like. So for example, in the first category, there are things like, this is a very, there are loads and loads of browser plug extensions for Facebook that often do things like just removing the newsfeed from Facebook. There's another one here that's just like an Android app that you can use to block yourself from accessing distracting applications for a set amount of time. This is a very popular desktop app from the other category. It's called Rescue Time, that sends you these like weekly stats of how much time you spent on different applications on your laptop, and then you can sort of see how that compared to the goal that you had for how you wanted to use your device. This one is called Forest. Anyone know Forest? Nice. So this is cool. This is gamified attention in a way. You sort of set a timer for amount of time where you don't want to distract yourself. Then while the timer counts down, you get this cute animation of a tree that's being sown, and then it gradually goes into a complete tree. And then the catch is that if you leave the app to do something you shouldn't, then you kill the tree. Then the tree dies, and it's very sad. Then the tree doesn't get to go on to heaven, this little forest where you can see all of the trees that you have grown. A hilarious implementation of this is actually in the form of a browser extension for Facebook, where you get a virtual goat whose feeding is tied to how you use Facebook. So if you use too much time on Facebook, then the goat might starve to death. So it's really interesting. I mean, here's another one. This one's called Hold. This one is apparently used by 25% of all of the students in Norway. This one just gives you points for not using your phone while you're supposed to be studying. And then the points that you get are points that you can go exchange for real things in the real world. So you can go get a free coffee at a 7-Eleven if you have like 200 points, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure how this one is funded actually. I think this might actually be supported by the Norwegian government or something like that. So anyway, so there's this whole sort of interesting market. I just wanted to mention a couple because some of you have been looking into browser extensions for different things. So I just want to mention a couple more of the browser extensions for Facebook. This is really interesting because there's so much research on sort of Facebook addiction it's almost like an entire industry in academic research. And a lot of this academic research sort of ties problems on Facebook to poor self-regulation. But then if you go search on the Google Chrome web store for extensions for Facebook for distraction, then you get like loads and loads of them that do all sorts of different things. Like this, like the newsfeed eradicator replaces the newsfeed with a motivational quote. This might say all the great minds never went on Facebook or something. This one replaces the newsfeed with a to-do list. This one just removes everything except for the chat, if you think that's helpful. This one just occasionally reminds you to get back to work. This one asks you why you really went to Facebook when you logged in, and then you can be reminded. This one turns it black and white, and so on and so forth. There's a whole industry of these, and it's quite easy to develop these yourself. Browser extensions are really easy to develop. So most of these are sort of like individual people sitting in the basement being annoyed with how they use Facebook. Then they code something, and then they share it. Anyway, so apart from this sort of anti-distraction market, that's a very sort of bottom-up thing with individual developers building these apps and extensions. Now some of the big players are also entering this space. I don't know if you remember or if you saw, but there we go. Before Facebook got sidetracked by the whole Cambridge Analytica thing, then Zuckerberg actually announced that one of his goals in 2018 was to make sure that Facebook isn't just fun, but also good for people's well-being and for society. Imagine that you could be happier the more time you spend on Facebook. So they had this idea that, or he said, we're going to change the design goal of Facebook so that we don't just try to get people to spend as much time as possible on the site, but rather we want to try to make sure that the time you spend there is time well spent. I don't know how far they actually made it with this goal before everything sort of got sidetracked by Cambridge Analytica, but at least he was, if nothing else, virtue signaling here in January that they actually cared about this. Similarly, some of you might have seen just a couple of weeks ago at the WWDC, the Worldwide Developers Conference, when Apple announced what was going to happen in the next version of iOS, where they said that they were going to build a new app that's called Screen Time, that's supposed to be dedicated to some of the same things that's already going on in the anti-distraction market. That is, being able to see stats over how much time you spend on the different apps, and be able to set yourself limits, I only have 5 minutes left to play games today, and so on. And similarly, last month, Google said, great technology should improve life, not distract from it, and launched their own sort of digital well-being thing, where they are going to be building a lot of the same tools as well. At least they say so. All of this is still coming soon. They haven't actually done any of these things yet. But at least now all of the big players are at least trying to signal that they care about this. So now is the right time for you also to think a little bit at this hackathon, because there's a lot of at the moment all of these different ideas are going on. But no one knows how it's actually going to pan out, or what will be the most successful ways of building the good design here. And no one knows how. So, for example, Google. If you compare Google and Apple, then and you think about their business models going back to the attention economy, then they're in slightly different situations, right? Because Google might effectively be undercutting their own revenue if they by getting people to use their devices less, whereas Apple is not in the same situation. So all of that is going to be really interesting. If we think about the second thing, about what would it look like to sort of try to disrupt some of the economic incentives in this space in the first place, we don't really have any good answers at all. Some of the things that are going on is that maybe some of you have heard of time well spent, which is this sort of grassroots movement, which just changed the name to Center for Humane Technology. That's just more about trying to raise awareness that it's important for designers to try to design technology that's in people's own interest, basically. They have had quite a lot of sort of media impact, and might be one of the forces behind that. Now some of the big tech companies feel that they have to at least signal that they care about this. The founder of Time Well Spent, Tristan Harris, used to be at Google. One of the other sort of technical fixes that people have been thinking about is things like micropayments. So imagine if you automatically paid a tiny amount every time you went on some website, then the websites didn't have to necessarily show you advertisements and so on. Google actually introduced something called Google Contributor, where you sort of can pay websites that don't have ads on them through these micropayments. It hasn't really taken off, but people have been talking about this for a while. The alternative processes, of course, are related to regulation in various ways. Because this wonderful book, The Attention Merchants, is sort of like a history of the market for capturing people's attention and then sort of selling that on to advertisers, for example. Because we developed regulations for how people should be allowed to advertise on television and so on. So maybe there are similar sort of regulations that should be in place when we think about the web, but no one has any of the right answers here. You probably know that Germany has been one of the most sort of vocal political voices in terms of putting pressure on Facebook for saying, fake news, which is kind of like a direct product of the attention economy, is kind of like your problem and you should remove it. But again, we don't have any good answers here yet. So yes, so I don't think I'm going to say anything. I was going to say a little bit more specific about what things you might think of, but I think I'm going to leave that because you already have some good ideas for the projects already. So just want to say that I think there are at least sort of two interesting and quite distinct challenges in this space, where one of them is just about exploring what the good design for the future looks like for design of these like all these connected devices that can be designed in a way that's aligned with our psychological weaknesses, so that it's as easy for us as possible to align our intended use with our actual use. And then the other challenge is about how to disrupt the economic incentives of the attention economy, so that companies are also incentivized to build devices that are actually designed in these sort of useful ways. So I'm really excited to see what you all will come up with, and I think I'm just gonna leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Anybody have any questions for Ulrik?
Yeah. Could you give us the names of those extensions you just showed?
Yes.
The one that gives you coffee for not being.
Yeah. So the one with the coffee is called Hold. That one, so you can. It's only particular places in the world where you can use it, because I think they team up with particular organizations who are interested. I think if you're enrolled in particular schools in the UK, then you might actually get free coffee from those schools if you.
The university has it.
Interesting. Which Edinburgh?
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So and it's paid. So then it's. So,
like coffee and
aha.
Amazon scratch things.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, there are loads of them, but I can give you a list afterwards if you're interested.
Do you know if any of those extensions or apps actually help?
So that's partly what my PhD research is about.
Can you repeat the question?
Do we know which of them actually help? The short answer is we don't. I mean, we don't really know. It's because people are only just starting to do research on this. I mean, there was a reason. So I was at the Chi conference in Montreal a couple of months ago, where someone had done a study on some of these apps that like block your access to certain websites, where she kind of felt that for those people that were already struggling with managing distractions, it helped them a lot with the productivity and with the sort of feelings of being able to be in control. But for those people who are already good at managing distractions, it was as if it looked like it harmed them more than it helped, because they became too efficient. Like they didn't take any breaks, and they ended up feeling under more pressure. But by and large, we don't really know. We do know that sometimes these visualization tools. I mean, sometimes it's people look at them and they're like, oh, that's nice, or oh, that's not nice. But then it doesn't really matter. But we are really only starting to do research on it. So I'm running a research study this autumn to test how some of the extensions for Facebook actually change people's behavior. Because we would expect that some of the tools probably maybe just make people feel better, but don't actually change the behavior, and some of them, to be vice versa. But we don't really have very much evidence yet. You can of course just look at the ratings of these apps and the extensions and try to and what people write in the reviews, and then try to estimate it from that. But we don't have very much academic research yet. Fortunately, because that's what my PhD is about. Anything else?
All right, let's thank
Cool. Thank you.
Ulrik again.